We've already seen some basic selectors like the element selector. I think we've seen the class selector. So in this video, we're just gonna learn a few more because there's a whole variety of selectors that you could use in CSS. So let's see. So I'm just gonna, before going over the selectors, I just want to set up some elements to select. Okay, so an H2, an H3, and a div with these elements inside it, and then a strong tag. Okay, and this div doesn't need a class. Get rid of that. Okay, let's see this. Okay, cool. Okay, so the first thing is the universal selector. So the universal selector looks like this. It's just a star, and it just selects everything. So every element on your page will get selected. So you could say font, font family. I'm going to do font weight, normal, and it'll just select all of your H1s and the strong tag, everything. There, pretty cool. Although you probably shouldn't, you should probably try not to use the universal selector because it's known to be really slow. Okay, so moving on, we got this one's going to combine the element selector with the class selector. So what I mean by that is you could select an element like an H1 or H2 or any element that has a specific class. So it's a lot more specific than just selecting an element or just selecting a class. You're selecting an element with that class. So let's do H1 dot highlight. So this actually doesn't exist yet. So let's go create it. Let's put one right here. The class. I keep doing that. I put the U instead. Okay, so what do you want to do to the highlight class? We can get a color of lime and a background color of this darker color. Okay, let's see. Okay, so it only selects this. And if we put the highlight class here on the H2, it's not going to be selected because the H2 isn't an H1. So this is only selecting H1s with highlight. Okay, the next one. The next one is the Descendant Selector. So the Descendant Selector is like selecting all elements that are inside another element. So one thing that you could do, like just for example, H1. Okay, so this is going to select all H1s. But another thing that you could do to select all H1s is just to do this. Body H1. And this does the same thing because all H1s are going to be in the body. So this does the same thing as just selecting H1, but you can do other things. You can say div H1. So now this is only going to select an H1 that's inside a div. So let's see that. Let's do the font size, 66 pixels. And it's only going to select this one, not this one. Okay, next we're going to be covering some pseudo classes. So we've already seen this with the hover that we did on the button. So there's other pseudo classes. There's a few of them actually. We're just going to be covering a few in this video. So H1 first child. So what this does is it selects all H1s that are first children. Okay, so what does it mean to be a child? Well, you could think of, if you look here at the body, there's sort of a lot of nesting going on in HTML. You'll notice that a lot. Like the body is inside the HTML tag, and inside the body there's an H1. Well, you could think of the H1 as a child of the body because the H1 is directly inside the body. So it's like the H1 is a child of the body and the body is the parent of the H1. And then you can look at this H1 and you can see that this H1 is the child of the div. So you could think of this H1 here that I have selected, its grandparent would be the body because its parent is the div and the div's parent is the body. So if you go back here to here, the H1, that's the first child, which H1s are going to be selected by this? Well, there's this H1 that is a child of the body, and it is the body's first child. The first element that appears in the body is this h1. So this h1 will, this one right here, the first one, will be selected in this selector right here. Also, this h1 will be too, because the div has children and its first child is the h1. So this selector here will select both. So let's just say text transform, whoops, uppercase, and you'll see it'll select both. They're both uppercase. And then there's also last child too. So you could say h3, whoops, no space, last child and strong. Let's do this. Color blue. Okay, so as like a mini challenge to you, I want you to guess how many elements this selector is going to select. So this selector here is kind of like two selectors. So how many elements will both of these selectors select? You can take a second to think about it, maybe pause the video. Well, it's actually only going to select one. It's because the strong tag, that's automatic because there's a strong tag there. And this is just saying select the strong tag. So that's one. And there are no h3 that are the last child. In the body, the last child is the div. And in the div, the last child is the strong tag. So the only thing that's going to be blue is the strong tag here. And another thing before we move on to specificity is you can combine selectors in any way that you want. So you could do something like let's say div h1 that has the class of alt, font, and then a. So you can combine them like this. You could also say div first child. So this element actually this isn't going to actually select anything on our page. I'm just showing you as an example. You can combine these in any ways that you want. Okay, so now we're going to move on to specificity. So I'm going to actually start a different example right here. I want to do an h1. Okay, and let's give this header an ID of main header. And let's do this. h1, h1. Okay, let's look at this. So there's an h1 and it's blue. So the reason why it's blue is because both of these selectors are selecting the same thing. And so when they're selecting the same thing and the selectors are equal strength, so these selectors are both identical, so they are equal strength, then it's whichever one comes last is the one that becomes activated, the one that it uses. So that's what's known as the cascade. That's the C in CSS, because CSS stands for cascading style sheets. So that's what the cascade means. It'll just overwrite whatever comes later. So if you did another h1 right now and change the color again, it would become this color. But there's ways to make a selector more specific to make it be activated even if it's overwritten by a CSS rule that comes after it. So if you did something like this, main header, so now it's going to be crimson even though this one comes after it. See? Okay, so what are the rules for calculating the specificity? Because this one seems pretty clear cut that this one is more specific than this one. But as I mentioned before, you can combine selectors, and sometimes it's pretty rare, but sometimes selectors can get pretty long. And there's what's known as the specificity wars, where you have certain rules fighting other rules, where you might want one rule to be more specific than the other one, but it's not, and you want the one that's least specific to become activated, so you have to make that one more specific, and it could just get a little bit messy. So how do you calculate it? Well, it's actually really simple. It's whichever selector has more IDs will win. So the first thing is whichever has more IDs will win. And that's not how you spell whichever. It's supposed to be an H. So whichever has more IDs will win. And if they're tied for IDs, then it goes to the classes. So these ones actually have no classes right here, but if you did something like, let's do this again, class, highlight, and just do this. So if they're tied for IDs, then, and you could do that like this actually, it's the same thing. Main header. So now this one's going to win. And we could just verify that. That's going to turn blue. Okay, so if they're tied for IDs, whichever has more classes will win. And that also includes pseudo classes that we saw earlier. So if you did h1 first of type dot highlight, this is actually two classes, because this is considered a class when calculating the specificity. That's why it's called a pseudo class. And then this is a class because it has the dot. Okay, so if it's tied for IDs and it's tied for classes, then it's whichever has more elements will win. So elements is just like h1, the h1s that you see here. If you did something like body, this has two. This selector right here has 2 elements, 1 ID, and 2 classes. So you would say this one right here, 1 ID. I should put that in something like this. 2 classes, and 2 elements. Okay, so that's pretty much going to be